Okay, I'm just going to talk for 1 minute about why we are here. About 2 months ago, I started to talk with Rav Maurice about coming to Toronto and talk to us about stuff. And when talking to Rav Maurice about stuff, it's about Israel. And everybody around me said, judicial overhaul, this, that, and the other, democratia, you know, everybody's upset about that, he's got to talk about that. And it never excited me. I said, it's family squabbles. You know, the existential threat to Israel is beyond. You know the movie about the friends in a cabin in the woods and they're all fighting each other, and then the camera zooms out and you see the Walking Dead approaching, you know? That's the real threat. And to understand why the conflict that has been in running for decades is not resolved, given that there have been efforts to resolve it. And one of the biggest efforts is called Oslo, and it's very misunderstood. But it accomplished many things and set certain things in motion. At the end, it did not result in peace. Why not? Hope that Rav Maurice will help us understand and then think about what the future might hold. And Rav Maurice works for the Reconstructionist organization and specialty on Israel. And Rav Maurice, it's yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me. And as you can imagine, when we were talking about this being one of the things I would be leading a program on, it was before this horrible week, this horrible last 8 days erupted into the world. And I have more or less the same material that I want to share with you, but I think the frame is different. So what I would like to do is just say a word about myself and how I approach and teach about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and have for about 20 years. And this is something that I've taught as an adjunct faculty member at the University of Oregon, in addition to working as a rabbi, and it's something that I've done some teaching around the movement. I do not speak officially for the movement. I am offering you my own insights, ideas, and analysis, and everyone's going to agree with some things, not agree with other things, and it's always on a spectrum, and I'm always interested in hearing from what people observe, and the feedback I've gotten from people has led to me making changes in material I've presented. Usually if it really stings, I go and study some more, and I try and learn some more, and then there ends up being a new segment of material that I offer, and it usually incorporates some of where the person was coming from, and then some other ideas that I learn about by opening the gateway to whatever it is that they felt I didn't give enough weight to, or that I gave too much weight to, etc. So how do I approach this? I'll just share two pieces about it. So one is a personal history piece. I was born in the US. My mother is a Moroccan Israeli Jewish woman who married an Ashkenazi Jewish Midwestern American man. She's one of a family of 12 siblings who went through very severe and violent persecution in the 50s in Morocco and literally fled Morocco in the middle of the night with no possessions and no money. Ended up in a refugee camp in southern France on their way to Israel, where today I probably have about 80 members of my extended family who live still predominantly in working class areas that are heavily Moroccan in Israel. My mom was kind of an outlier. She's not someone who would use this word to describe herself, but she basically was a feminist before anyone used the word. She didn't want to be married at 17 with a kid already on the way. She saw how that went for her mother, who gave birth 16 times, by the way. 12 of her kids survived to adulthood. So my growing up included spending a big part of every summer in the 70s and the 80s embedded with this sprawling Moroccan working class Israeli bunch of relatives running around in between apartments and running down to the beach and in parks. And for me, that really is Israel. So I'm bilingual and I have deep visceral attachments and love for Israel. The encounters that I started to have in my 20s and then throughout my whole adult life with Palestinians have caused me to grow, stretch, and be uncomfortable as an adult. But they've also enriched my life tremendously. Some of my dearest friends in the world include 2 Palestinian families who live in Bethlehem, and I have been friends on and off with a young man who is a blogger in Gaza, who is an advocate for democracy and free speech, and often tells people he may be offline for a while because he doesn't want Hamas to find him. But he's also, very much a committed Palestinian nationalist. And all of those friends have done something that I think is very important to happen to any human being, which is when you develop visceral ties to people, you care about them and you meet their children, it scrambles the part of your brain that can separate from your emotions and maybe think a little bit more dispassionately or with complexity about a conflict. And I am agonized at times, but grateful ultimately for having those emotional and visceral ties. When I have taught about the conflict, and I teach a multi-part course about it, I teach from what a number of scholars, both Jewish, Palestinian, and people with neither identity, but who have done a great job studying, refer to as a dual narrative approach to the conflict. And what a dual narrative approach is interested in is how these two peoples construct and understand their operating narrative of the conflict. And obviously, this is a problem to use this model because within the Israeli Jewish community, that you could actually say there are 6 or 7 very different narratives, and same thing in the Palestinian community. 20% of Palestinians are Christian. They have their own variation, but it's still useful to oversimplify sometimes. And what I do in my dual narrative approach is I follow the lead of a number of scholars who have basically said, look, treat this as a starter package of information. These are rough sketches of what you could say is sort of the generic floating narrative that really dominates both societies. And an awful lot of academics who have studied each part of these 2 narratives will really zoom in on some of the most disputed facts, because there are a lot of disputed facts in these 2 narratives. And sometimes there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that really clearly shows that one of these narratives is a lot closer to the facts than the other. But a huge proportion of the time, the evidence that exists, and I'm talking about a dispassionate historian's approach to gathering evidence, is muddled, is tainted, and is hard to reach final conclusions around. And what I think led some of these scholars to decide that what was maybe more important than forever arguing, about just how much intelligence the Israeli government had before the start of the Six-Day War and how that affected their particular decisions, or just what it was that Arafat and his team saw presented as a proposed final status agreement in the talks that collapsed in the year 2000, because those are all highly disputed accounts, and the people who were in the rooms don't agree with each other about what was said. They've all written books, and they all contradict each other. Instead of wasting time focusing on that, the conclusion was, actually what matters and what is just as real is the narrative that's running like an operating system in most people's heads. Because it's that narrative that, that needs to be addressed in order to figure out a way to go forward, and to go forward in a way that could look like a future that is a few different things. More peaceful, more fair, and sustainable. Those are sort of the three most important things, at least to me. So that's the approach that I have taken to this subject. In a week like this, it's really hard to shift into this more cerebral and analytical posture with all of you. I'm in agony. I know folks in here are too. And, you know, for what it's worth, I want to say one thing about that, and then I'll do my best to offer some of this material. If it hits you in a way that really hurts, all I ask is don't curse me out if you're mad at me. just tell me, just say, hey, I don't agree with you, and I don't like that you put it that way. What about this? That's all I would ask. And then the other thing, because it goes back to what Rabbi Tina said, for Judaism Judaism holds the intersection of healthy tribalism with a divine mandate for universal values, and it holds those things in tension. So what I just ask for is that we all make an effort on the values side of that to try to refrain from using dehumanizing language. And you might all be thinking he means about the Palestinians, but actually I also often hear it in more liberal Jewish communities about the settlers. Those crazy maniacs, you know, blah, 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 blah. Like, I ask us to all do our best to try to refrain from language that is sort of ridiculing or dehumanizing, and we'll all do our best, and I might mess up. So that's that piece. In terms of a personal piece about how this hits me hard and hurts, it hits me hard and hurts on the level of the way in which the Hamas attacks resemble the strategy implemented by the pogroms and by the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that the Nazis sent out into Poland and Ukraine and parts of the East before they implemented the concentration camps. These were mobile killing units sent out in trucks with semi-automatic weapons, and you might think, well, that's probably not touching on his family's experience, but that's not true. My mother's family lived in Morocco during a time when the Nazis occupied it briefly and then handed it over to the Vichy authorities, who immediately began implementing, attempted to implement a census and segregation of the Jewish population. The SS built at least three small concentration camps in remote areas of Morocco in preparation for implementing the final solution there. The Vichy French government collaborated with enthusiasm, and as many of you might know, it was the Moroccan King Mohammed V who very publicly told the Vichy French and the Nazis that neither he nor anyone in his government would cooperate with them to harm his Jewish subjects. And for that, he was expelled and sent into exile, and a puppet was appointed in his place. There are 2 parks in Israel named in his honor. And he really very publicly told them to shove it, which is amazing. So there's that piece that this hits for me, and then in terms of the other way that it hits me is the first job I held in Jewish communal life was that I worked as the administrator of an organization called the San Francisco Area Holocaust Oral History Project, where I was in the room for 50 4-hour-long interviews with survivors. And, you know, the echoes of those testimonies are really resonating for me. So, whew, having shared all of that with you, I'm now going to try to talk a little bit about this thing that was called Oslo, and I would love to ask, I have almost 40 of these packets. Don't worry, they're all pictures. If people can share them, I say don't worry, they're all pictures because I hate getting a packet with lots of small print and bullet points. And as I talk about this, I really am kind of stepping back into this very sort of familiar internal consciousness of a teaching modality where to some extent I'm coming from a more dispassionate place. And while this is getting handed out, I want to offer a little bit of context that will lead right up to the very first page of this packet. So the context I want to offer has to do with the way that Israel and the PLO fought each other for about 25 years. Okay, so from roughly just after the 1967 war until 1993, the signing of the Oslo Accord, Israel and the PLO were basically at war. And the PLO was it was many things. It was a government in exile. It was an umbrella organization with a legislature that included representatives of several different political parties with different visions and goals and ideologies. And it also trained an army, and it also at times organized, gave the orders for, or at least cheerled acts of terrorism. And it formed in the mid-60s, but really got organized into a more cohesive organization that gained legitimacy throughout the Arab world and the wider Muslim world after the Six-Day War. And then pushing through the 70s, you know, a lot of folks in here are old enough to remember what that war kind of looked like. During the 70s, the PLO started out headquartered in Jordan. Eventually, the Jordanian government was so threatened by them that they massacred them and kicked them out. They reestablished themselves in southern Lebanon and created a mini-state in southern Lebanon. And then that war continued back and forth. It typically looked like raids into Israel that often targeted civilians by the PLO, and then Israeli Air Force bombing reprisals that, I'm going to be really blunt, got some of the bad guys but killed a lot of civilians, including a lot of southern Lebanese civilians who weren't very happy to have half their country taken over by the PLO. And that kind of went on, and then the PLO sort of shifted along with some groups that thought the PLO wasn't radical enough into the mode of deciding that their best tactic was to destabilize the wealthy Western world. So that was when you had the spate of airplane hijackings and airport shootings and blowing up the 1976 Olympics and killing the Israeli Olympic team. And then this pattern of Israeli reprisals that grew more and more intense and that created asymmetrical response. That was the military tactic that Golda Meir decided, was the first prime minister to decide that was going to be what was going to happen. If you kill one of us, we're going to kill a bunch more of you. And eventually, that's how they'll learn. Historians would say that that whole approach, neither side's approach, has been successful. The PLO's embrace of the only way those Zionists will learn is if we do some really brutal, awful things to them and all their friends. That hasn't worked. That's only stiffened the Jewish people's resolve. And a lot of historians would argue the tactic of, we're going to bomb these guys and everyone around them to smithereens every time they do one of these things. That hasn't given Israel the security that it wanted. And one of the things that Israel has learned is that chasing the PLO out of one place has created these vacuums where groups that are a lot worse have then come in and taken over. So this is an enormous dilemma. So that's all depressing context, right? So then this thing happens. This horrible thing, the Lebanon War in 1982, out of which, at least for the Israelis, one positive thing happened, which was that they chased the PLO out of Lebanon, and the PLO regroups in Tunis. And in 1988, the PLO convenes its parliament, and they pass a declaration that they are going to change their political goals to seek a long-term resolution and agreement with Israel, not an acceptance of the justice of Israel's existence, but that they are going to seek as a political goal a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. This might surprise a lot of you. The sort of first major political overture that looks like this thing we call the two-state solution is voted on and passed by the PLO's Congress and signed by Arafat in 1988 in Tunis. And then the PLO starts putting out diplomatic feelers to see if this might be viable. So two things happen right after that happened. Number one, these Israelis and Palestinians involved in the PLO start having secret meetings. That's how between 1988 and 1993 you get to Oslo. And these meetings are very secret, so secret that a lot of top Israeli leaders don't know that they're happening. The other thing that happens is the PLO suddenly is seen as a collaborationist, cowardly, betraying, Western appeasing organization in the eyes of the growing phenomenon of Islamic fundamentalism, and in the eyes of the more radical political factions that had been part of the PLO. So some of them quit the PLO, and Hamas really takes off. Hamas publishes its charter in 1988, in part as a manifesto objecting to this idea of any kind of compromise or accommodation with Israel. And it is very much coming from the larger fundamentalist reactive movement that swept through different parts of the Islamic world throughout the 80s, right? And that gains this momentum. And, you know, we have to keep in mind these fundamentalist movements that form their own militias and that govern either officially or unofficially over parts of Muslim populations, govern as religious tyrannies. They are led by people who are absolutely convinced that that God wants them to implement a specific kind of fundamentalist Islamic society that will control the lives not just of any Jews who might live under their rule, but also Muslims, most of whom would not really like living under their rule. Palestinian Christians, by the way, absolutely do not want to live under this kind of rule. So that's a little bit of context of what's happening. There's a ironic and sad small piece that's worth mentioning here. While the Israelis and the PLO were basically fighting each other on many different fronts, including having their spies assassinate each other all over Europe, the Israeli government saw a much smaller and less powerful Hamas operating in Gaza in the middle 80s, primarily as a social welfare organization distributing direct aid to people in poverty and successfully operating schools and hospitals. The Israelis were the occupying power in Gaza at that time. They weren't providing the resources to do that. The UN Refugee Agency for Palestine was sort of doing it, but was not able to do it really effectively. And the way that most Gazans thought about Hamas, most Gazans are not fanatically religious, and even if they were, they wouldn't necessarily subscribe to this particular strand of ideology. It's really quite very, very narrow and kind of anomalous compared to sort of more mainstream expressions of Islam over the centuries. But what they saw was, here are these guys who were super religious. I'm not sure I would want my daughter to marry one of them, but they're not corrupt. They are completely sincere. My kids are safe around them, and they take whatever resources they're able to get their hands on and they get stuff done. There's no red tape. They obviously care. Meanwhile, I don't know if folks are aware of this, but the PLO and Arafat's entourage and the legislators who were part of the Legislative Council and the Tunis crew living pretty good lives, kind of a Gucci revolution, as they were sometimes derisively referred to by other Palestinians. So Hamas is gaining this credibility in the mid-'80s, and at that time, Israeli leaders thought, this is great, enemy of my enemy. The PLO was really afraid of Hamas because they saw that how much more popular than they were with the ordinary people, and they also saw that Hamas had longer-term ambitions to take over political leadership of the Palestinians from the PLO, and Hamas wasn't joining the PLO, and as I said, when the PLO in 1988 said, we'll accept two states, with, by the way, certain conditions apply, which might not have worked for Israelis, but still, they said this forbidden thing. The PLO was really afraid of them, and before Israeli leaders could imagine how much they would later regret this, they actually worked on many different levels to support, encourage, and bolster Hamas's success as a social movement until around 1988. And then as Hamas developed a really robust militant wing and became much more overt with some of its anti-Semitic ideology, then, Israel changed course. So now, let's talk about 1993 and this handout. So the first thing I want to say about the first page of this handout, what you're seeing is the emblem of the city of Oslo. And, somewhere between 1988 and 1993, under tremendously impressive secrecy, a impressive diplomatic initiative with a lot of different players quietly providing encouragement and support, including the Norwegians, sort of kept the possibility of some kind of formal agreement going following the PLO's 1988 declaration. And So in 1993, we're all getting ready for Rosh Hashanah, and boom, we're kind of all stunned, right, by this announcement that there is imminently going to be a White House lawn ceremony, that there is now a formal agreement of mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO that includes a peace plan that will have to be phased in over 5 to 10 years. And that it's kind of already cooked. And, you know, I mean, sure, the hard part's still ahead of us, but the agreement is ready to be inked. Everybody's going to gather on the White House lawn and sign it. And it was amazing, right? And there were 5 major final status issues that this agreement committed the two parties to work out over the next 5 to 10 years. And they're on this front page, right? So what are the borders of these? The Oslo Agreement didn't use the word 2 states, mainly because the Israelis felt like they might not be, that might kill it before it had a chance in the eyes of their own public. But it was understood by everyone that it was weird to just sort of keep saying, well, this independent sovereign Palestinian entity, which what we might someday call a state. So for lack of the mushy wording, it envisioned 2 states, and they needed to negotiate their borders. They needed to figure out sovereignty and a bunch of logistical arrangements about Jerusalem, right? And it was agreed that they disagreed about what their starting positions were on that. This question of Palestinian refugees going back all the way to 1948 and the PLO's demand for a right of return, that was going to, some kind of compromise agreement was going to have to be negotiated about that. And just as I said, the Israelis didn't want the word state used, but they understood we were talking about a state. The PLO didn't want the word compromise used about the right of return of refugees. For them, that was the thing they thought would get all their leaders quickly assassinated. Even though they understood there was no final agreement the Israelis could agree to that wasn't a compromise for the Palestinians on right of return. Security arrangements and then settlements. What to do with the settlements that already existed in Gaza and the West Bank? Would they be annexed into Israel? Would they become part of a Palestinian state? Would there be some other creative arrangement? All of these things were the 5 things. So now let's turn the page. So the most important thing, actually, that changed that day in September of 1993 was that the Israeli government and the PLO formally recognized each other. What that meant was that the PLO formally and before the entire international community said, we acknowledge and accept that the Israeli government and the state of Israel are here to stay. They didn't say, we acknowledge that this is the Jews' natural right, because that they probably couldn't get away with saying. But in terms of reaching not a solution, but an agreement, what they were declaring was, we recognize that the state of Israel exists and we are prepared to accept that as a permanent reality, and we recognize the government of Israel as our negotiating partner to reach a final status agreement. Israel, for its part, publicly said, we no longer are declaring the PLO to be a terrorist organization, and we join the Arab nation states and other nation states that recognize the PLO as the sole legitimate representative political organization for the Palestinian people. And they are our negotiating partner to try to achieve the goals of this agreement over the next 5 to 10 years. Now, there were 2 things that both sides agreed to do starting immediately. And I'm going to tell you right now, neither side did it. The Israelis promised they would not expand settlements, that would stop while they were going forward with these negotiations. Between 1993 and now, the number of settlers in the West Bank went from 150,000 to 500,000. The number of settlements, including in far-flung places, has increased dramatically. But what really helped, one of the things that helped thwart Oslo from achieving its goals was that successive Labor and Likud-led Israeli governments just would not refrain. They would sometimes pause, but they just would not refrain from continuing to move this forward. The PLO promised to absolutely desist from committing any acts of terrorism and to assist the Israeli security forces with intelligence to help thwart terrorist events. Surprisingly, perhaps, on that score, especially during the first 5 years of this, the Palestinian Authority, the government that got created through this agreement, did a pretty good job. Most Israelis will say, actually, yes, that kind of happened. Now, they may have done a pretty good job in part out of self-interest. They wanted to control all the levers, including the lever of violence, just as the Israeli government wants to control all its levers, including the lever of violence. But the other thing that the PLO promised to do, as they were getting ready to bring their government in to the West Bank and Gaza and start to govern some initial pieces of territory, was they promised that they would not abide any kind of anti-Semitic or extremely violent and dehumanizing and demonizing media incitement aimed either at Jews or at Israel. So they didn't do this at all. And so what would happen throughout the course of the first 5 years of this agreement is the two sides actually would make a lot of concrete progress in a bunch of areas, and then they would meet up and they would present their complaints about what the other side was failing to do. And the PLO would say, you know, you just announced 4,000 more apartment units. And the Israelis would say, but that's not really expanding settlements. That's the settlement we already started, or we already had the building permits before. And the Palestinians would be like, so that's more important to you than the psychological impact that this has on all of us, because you're basically making everybody on our side think you're just lying to us. And the Israelis would say, no, you're just being, you know, don't worry about it. We're gonna reach a final agreement, and we're doing this to hold our own far-right people off to the side so that we can get to the finish line. So then the Israelis would say, now you guys, now you're operating your own TV and your own radio stations, and you keep having these different people on who are broadcasting these things that are like still like portraying all Zionists as monsters who celebrate killing children, and including some other people who are openly spouting anti-Semitic stuff from the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and you said you were going to knock that off. And invariably, the PLO would say, you know, we're working on it, but actually, I think you guys are too sensitive. You don't understand Arab culture. You don't, it's not so easy to rein all these people in. We have to be strategic about this. It's better than it was. You have your own racists in your society, don't you? But again, it was sort of an unwillingness to acknowledge this was the one thing that both parties said they would do that they just couldn't bring themselves to do. So now I want to ask you to turn the next page. So now we're going to spend a couple of years in sort of the glory days of Oslo, because there were actually a couple of glorious years. So, probably just as astonishing to people as seeing Arafat and Rabin shake hands was the establishment of the Palestinian Authority to be the government of, what was expected to eventually be a Palestinian state. And it was based on this model of the first phase is there will be an enclave around the city of Jericho and all of Gaza. And those will be the two areas that are governed by the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority will have police, not an army, except both sides knew it was an army. And Arafat's homecoming, and the first capital was in Gaza City. His headquarters was in Gaza City, and he was now elected president of the Palestinian Authority, and they had legislative elections with a bunch of parties running. Right? So like that was celebrated with enormous fanfare. Oh my God, the international community pumped so much money, so fast into this initiative. And for a little while, there was this little economic boomlet. All of a sudden, seaside restaurants all up and down Gaza are bustling with business. The borders were still open. A lot of Israelis started going to those restaurants in Gaza. I happened to go to a restaurant in Gaza with a group of Israelis in 1996 and watched a couple of 20-somethings who had served in Gaza in the IDF, chatting with a couple of waiters who had been PLO militants, and they were joking and trying to figure out whether they might have ever shot at each other. No, alcohol was not served at this restaurant. It was not, but the beaches were full, and don't get me wrong, the vast majority of Gaza was still desperately poor, but there's nothing quite like hope. There's nothing quite like tourism and flags and families, and it was like people were like, this might work. The other thing, and we'll see it in a minute on the next page, the Israeli army and the Palestinian Authority police, which was basically their army that they'd brought over largely from their training camps in Tunisia, combined with some of the militia fighters in the West Bank and Gaza, they started operating joint patrols, and the Mossad and the Palestinian secret intelligence agencies, and Arafat had like multiple intelligence agencies because he was a paranoid dictator who wanted to sort of operate a police state accountable to him. Side note. Nevertheless, they started sharing intelligence, and they were able to thwart a tremendous number of different potential acts of violence, mostly by Palestinian extremists, but also by some Jewish extremists who were starting to become more and more freaked out that this thing might actually happen. And as we'll see in a minute, the intensity, fervor, and growth of a particular kind of Jewish nationalist fundamentalism is also growing, right? Growing in numbers, growing in fervor, at the same time that Islamic fundamentalism was growing. And I can, as somebody who grew up in the Midwest in the United States, during this period when Christian fundamentalism was also growing in political power and also growing in its stepping further away from the idea of the United States as a religiously pluralistic society, and instead wanting to change the mythic story of the United States to be a Christian nation that may tolerate others under some limited circumstances. So that's a wave that's everywhere, at least among the monotheistic religions. Go monotheism. Pardon my cynicism. And so this is happening for a certain segment of the Jewish population in Israel. They're becoming more and more alarmed. And for them, conceding 1 millimeter of territory, particularly in the parts of the land that were ancient biblical Israel, which ironically is basically the West Bank, not the coast, is like one of the worst sins that a Jew should commit. And about this, there is no compromise. Finally, infrastructure projects. One of the things the Oslo Agreement was very good at was pairing up technical experts from both sides and having them do intensive studies, water, electricity, common currency, rules of potential rules for trade, import, export, pollution, road systems, light rail, airports. It turns out a big part of the Palestinian expatriate population, including a lot of the descendants of refugees from '48, became well educated, got really good jobs as engineers, as doctors, as scientists in parts of the Arab world and in the West, and a lot of those folks got called in to serve on these teams. The Israelis invested heavily in educating their population, starting right from the 50s, right? And has has some of the most brilliant and smartest engineers and scientists anywhere in the world. Those groups tasked with sort of the problem solving of how do we make the puzzle pieces work so that everybody gets what they need, they made enormous progress. And they kept sort of presenting plan after plan after plan about how we can do this. They got a lot of water stuff figured out that was very, very impressive. And then funding that started supporting some of those initiatives tended to go where it was really supposed to go, in part because it had a lot of different eyes and hands on it and a lot of accountants tracking it. Okay, turn the page. Oslo Accords further implemented. If you could look at this map for a second and look at the West Bank on it, you see these blotches, right? So a while after the Gaza and Jericho phase was implemented, and it was implemented successfully, they implemented a next phase. And the dark brown blotches were all areas that came under the full authority of the Palestinian Authority. So what Palestinians living in those areas, and this includes most of the cities in the West Bank, what they viscerally experienced was the Israelis who had been patrolling their streets and coming in and doing arrests and all kinds of other stuff that felt scary. They witnessed them withdraw. And then they witnessed Palestinian police wearing their own uniform with their own colors replace them. And they took over these areas with full control. The yellowish areas, this phased into what was called Area B, where the Palestinian Authority governed everything except for security. And in Area B, it was mostly the Israeli army still monitoring, but there were also a lot of joint patrols. And you're going to see some photos in a minute. There were these jeeps with 2 Israelis and 2 Palestinians, and all 4 of them were holding those big old guns that you see when you visit Israel and you see people in the IDF walking around with these big old guns. All 4 of them had their guns, and sometimes the Palestinian dudes would have keffiyehs on along with their uniform, and they were doing joint security patrols. And it was pretty effective. Now, I mentioned this blotchy map right now for another reason. Today, right, a lot of folks who have concluded that the two-state solution is dead, and that it's never going to happen, and particularly a lot of folks who side with both feet with the Palestinians, they look at this map of blotches and they say, see, this isn't a state, these are Bantustans, this is apartheid. This is what apartheid looks like, a bunch of little quasi-self-governing caged enclaves surrounded by a military power. I just want to point out that the same map with the blotches on it in 1994 was viewed by the entire international community as this magnificent sign of hope. Because these blotches here are bigger than the first set of blotches. which were just Jericho and Gaza. And the promise of the Oslo Agreement was that we succeed at each stage, we build confidence from the grassroots out, and then we proceed to the next stage. So we're taking manageable risks in stages, and that will ready the majorities of both populations to accept the hardest decisions in the final status round. So the context always matters. That's all I'm just trying to point out. This was the framework both parties agreed to, that the blotches would grow over time and that they would build confidence together. So if you turn the next page, you can see some of the benefits that these photos are from 1994 and 1995. You know, right off the bat, the Israelis get this next peace agreement with Jordan. Huge morale boost for Israelis. You know, I grew up in Hebrew school with people saying Israel is surrounded by enemy countries on all sides. Then Egypt made peace with Israel, and it was like, Israel is surrounded by enemy nations on most sides. And then Jordan makes peace with Israel, and you know, Israel now has peace agreements with, you know, along its two longest borders. Obviously, they're challenged, they're potentially vulnerable peace agreements, but to a lot of folks in 1994, this feels like shocking progress, right? You can see one example of one of the places where the Israelis and Palestinians have a center for joint patrols in Gaza. This is an unthinkable image in the current moment with the two flags painted at the site. You can see one of the images of, you know, this sort of boom of tourism and activity and families spending time at the beach in Gaza. And, you know, I mean, Ramallah still has great nightlife, but you really start seeing these things develop. And if you turn the page again, in the upper corner, you can see an example of the one of the mixed patrol forces of the Israelis and Palestinians. And you can see the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded to these three men. Again, these are all moments that you might look at cynically today, but in the moment that they happened, they seemed to be they seemed to be saying, this is how it's going. I happen to remember listening, this is around 1994, before the agreement that has still held, God willing it will continue to hold, in Northern Ireland was achieved. And there had been a real eruption of some brutal, brutal violence on both sides in that conflict. And I remember seeing, I don't even remember if it was someone from the Protestant or the Catholic side of that conflict, go on TV with tears. It was a woman, and she was a diplomat of some sort, and she just said, damn it, if the Israelis and the Palestinians can do it, we can do it. And, you know, at the time, I was just I thought I was living in a parallel universe, but I was giddy. You know, and now when I think about that moment, of course, it just breaks my heart. So now I want to ask for help. I have another handout. I've described to you sort of how things were going when they were going about as well as they could. And, you know, I think that you could probably narrate to me the highlights or the lowlights of major events that, starting in 1995 and going forward, all helped thwart the success of this progress, right? So, super obvious ones, the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin, right? Super obvious ones, Hamas turning to a devastating series of bus bombings, including 3, I think, in the space of 2 weeks in 1996, just before the Israelis had a crucial election that killed some shocking number of civilians, as well as bombing clubs and restaurants, right? So you have these very, very horrifying news spectacle events carried out violently by extremist groups on both sides who feel so threatened by the possibility of the Oslo process achieving its goals that they want to do whatever they can to literally blow it up. I'm happy to take a question, but I might hold answers till later.
I just want to comment.
Yeah.
Before it started to blow up, I remember hearing somebody talking disparagingly about the curriculum changes in Israel itself, that they were rewriting history.
Excuse me, if I could just say, we'll take questions at the end. This is being Zoomed. There are people not only in Toronto but in Ottawa watching this. So we'll do it in a formalized way where people with questions would come up to the mic and be seen and heard, so that there are people other than in the room who are participating. But nobody can hear you when you speak.
Thanks for the facilitation, and it makes sense. And hopefully we can talk about that later. But I want to stick with this so I can make sure we get through it. So you have this sort of horrifying bingo card sheet in front of you, and what I actually want to do is I'm not going to do these in the order that they are on here, because they are not in any particular order. They are in a randomized order. Okay? And when I teach this is a PowerPoint slide from a multi-part course I teach. I scramble the order of these each time I do it. But I want to start with 1 and 2 because I just was speaking about them now, right? So this Jewish religious messianic nationalist movement that has grown dramatically and that has become the dominant political culture in the settler communities, and that also has a growing number of supporters and adherents within the Green Line, within that part of Israel, was intensely alarmed and determined to thwart this process from the moment the Oslo Agreement was signed, and was engaged in escalating threats of violence, threats against Prime Minister Rabin, and calls to incitement. And again, I don't want to ruffle feathers. I don't know whose favorite political parties people have in the Knesset, but my take on what the Likud party and Benjamin Netanyahu in particular did during this time was seek to leverage that hatred of Rabin and the Oslo process to their own advantage, and go right up to the line of overtly inciting anything beyond the use of rhetoric, and then sort of not quite cross that line. But I do agree with historians, Israeli and others, who feel that this is a political maneuver that helped Netanyahu get elected for the first time in 1996, and it's an indisputable fact that the Likud party was totally opposed to this agreement and did not want it to happen. Now, I'll say one thing in fairness to the Likud party. The Labor Party folks really kept the secret negotiation process that was going on with the PLO to themselves, and they made sure the Likud party folks did not know it was happening. So the Likud party folks kind of found out this was happening after it was a fait accompli. And one of their biggest arguments was, in a democracy with the most momentous existential decision we've ever made, how is it possible that you would try to sort of ram this past us? Okay, and at that time, you still had enough of these sort of founding generation titans of Israel, like Rabin and Perez, who were never really that thrilled with the Likud party because their memories extended back all the way to, even periods of violence between the originating groups behind those two parties before the state fully existed. And they were like, too bad, we have the majority, we're governing, we won. We did this way because we didn't trust that you wouldn't sabotage it if we let you in on it. And you can reach your own conclusions about that particular controversy. But moving into 1994, 95, 96, what you have is this very radical religious messianic group that also embraces a strand of orthodoxy that includes a very, very intense form of Jewish supremacist religious belief, okay? The more you learn it and study it, it's shocking. It's shocking to a lot of modern Orthodox folks who feel that it sort of just veers off the rails from that sort of balancing of tribal commitment and universal values that has been one of the hallmarks that makes Judaism a great world religion, right? So I'm naming that because I want to just name that this thing that we see happening among parts of the Christian and the Muslim world and the Hindu world with sort of radical Hindu nationalist religious fervor, right? And probably every faith community, except maybe, the Quakers and the Unitarians. This is a thing. And we're human, they're human, and religions, my big conclusion as a professional religious person is religions need to watch out for the ways in which they become toxic and do a better job of monitoring that. Now I'm going to talk about number 2, Islamic triumphalist zealotry. This is the same thing. There was, I think, a real dismissive attitude on the part of a lot of Western leaders, on the part of a lot of Israeli leaders, about how seriously to take the Islamic triumphalist and supremacist strands of the kind of Muslim fundamentalist and political objectives that Hamas embraces. And Hamas started as a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And to give you an example of what that looks like, in Egypt, the secular dictators who are horrible human rights abusers fear the Muslim Brotherhood because they know that should they successfully come to power, they will then impose their own religious dictatorship. And so what do? They round all of those leaders up and they imprison them and they martyr them. And then, very briefly, Egypt had a kind of real election and they actually elected a leader who was a part of that movement, but he didn't sort of he didn't go full throttle and do a makeover of the whole country as a Islamist dictatorship. That probably wasn't possible for him, but as soon as he was out of office, that old regime came back in, and they are determined to suppress brutally this movement. This movement, a Western point of view, says this movement has a right to not be tortured, not be wrongly imprisoned. Its members have all those rights, and they have the right to their freedom of belief. It's also a true fact that part of their belief is that they seek to take power. In Algeria, their motto was one person, one vote, one time. During the night, that was actually their motto as they campaigned for office. They are absolutely transparent and honest. They do not believe in democracy or pluralism. They believe they've been given a divine mandate to implement a kind of religious dictatorship. So I'm not saying that makes what the secular dictators of Egypt doing any less torturous and cruel. I'm just saying it's an example from a different society of how frightened people with power are of this other movement that also seeks power. And Hamas is cut from that ideological cloth. So Hamas bitterly hates the PLO, bitterly hates the Palestinian Authority, bitterly hates the political parties that have been part of the Palestinian legislature that espouse democratic values, okay? And seeks a particular vision. And they have, they use this fervor to justify and recruit the people who carry out suicide bombings and bus bombings, and this whole wave of really catastrophic violence in 1995 and 96 that helped oust the Labor government and bring in a Likud government that was immediately looking for ways to wriggle out of the Oslo Agreement. Now I'm going to skip around a little bit. I'm going to jump to number 5, okay? PLO corruption. The Palestinian Authority, as headed by Yasser Arafat and his Fatah party, was so corrupt that it's like they set records for the legendary nature of their corruption. The officials, the top and mid-level officials, were routinely derided by working class and poor Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza for having their passports stamped with all the capitals of Europe, for having apartments all over the world, for riding around in Mercedes. And of the billions and billions of dollars that actually went from the international community into the Palestinian Authority's coffers to utilize for building the foundations of a state, shocking amounts of that money were diverted and squandered. Between 1993 and 2004, 10 years during which Arafat served as president of the Palestinian Authority, they did not build a single new school or hospital, not one. And when Arafat died, and it's possible he was assassinated by name your pick of any number of either Israeli-Palestinian or other folks who really would have had it in for him. You know, what was discovered was that his spouse inherited over $500 million in funds that had been diverted from money that was meant to help build a Palestinian state. And got away with it. Like, got away with it. So this corruption was disastrous because there was momentum in those first couple years. And the idea of building trust between the two sides meant that there needed to be tangible rewards for ordinary people and a repeating cycle of people having an experience of hope. And I think there was some wisdom behind that thinking about planning this agreement. And in the areas where the two sides were good at that, it worked. In the areas where the international community succeeded in supporting and cheerleading and funding, and the money went where it was supposed to, it worked. But one of the ways that it was also supposed to work was that this money was supposed to help start building better roads, new schools, medical clinics, a hospital, possibly even a new city. Was supposed to do a lot of things that, and Palestinians knew. They knew what was happening. And a growing number of them stopped supporting Arafat's political party and started thinking, well, these guys from Hamas, they're a little fervent, but they are not corrupt. They won't take a penny that doesn't belong to them. It's against their moral code. You know, now that's probably an oversimplification, and I'm sure by now there is some corruption in the ranks of every one of these groups, but it's a comparison, right? So I just want to say a lot needs to be said. Is there corruption in Israel? Duh, yes, there's corruption in Israel, but not like this. Not like this. Nothing like this, okay? Nothing like billions of dollars of funds raised or granted and then accounted for. Like the Israeli government was a functional government throughout this period, able to provide receipts and accounting and independent auditing, right? That was not happening. Okay, I'm gonna do a couple more things here. I know we don't have that much more time, so I'm not gonna do all 16. We talked about the assassination of Rabin. A lot has been written and said about it. Probably one of the, you can tell with hindsight, weaknesses of the Oslo Accord was that it probably relied too heavily on the extremely unique place that Yitzhak Rabin of blessed memory held in Israeli society. There was just really nobody else quite like him in terms of his credibility, in terms of his credentials as a very gristled and tough and realistic warrior, and as someone compelling who had undergone some kind of personal transformation that led him to conclude that this was the best path forward for Israel. There was nobody else who sort of ticked all those boxes quite like him. And it's not like you could have waved a wand and quickly found 3 more people in case anything bad happened to him. But he probably should have had a more vigorous security detail. He was offered it repeatedly and he kept waving it away. He really just insisted that Israelis can be difficult and crazy and nuts, but they would never shoot one of their own. And he said this to people who were trying to get him to, kind of do more like what most world leaders have as their constant security entourage. I want to jump to numbers 3 and 12. Really interesting studies have been done by a few different groups of religious leaders and people involved in NGOs that support women's issues and women's political empowerment. And they point out that the negotiating teams that were involved from both sides in Oslo intentionally excluded religious leaders from their respective communities. And they were secularists who shared in common, as they were meeting across negotiating tables, a shared dislike and contempt for their own religious brethren, right? Like, we're cutting this delicious brie and we're talking about some kind of creative possible map for this border area, and what are you guys doing about your religious crazies? Oh, they're driving me up the wall. What are you guys doing about yours? Don't even get me started. It was that, the reflections that have been made is that this anti-clerical bias may have been a huge mistake. That there may have been, instead, an opportunity in the very early going to find a handful of well-respected Israeli Orthodox rabbis and a handful of Palestinian Muslim clerics who would buy in and who might also have some demands. Maybe their demands would have focused on the holy sites, probably. But to recognize that both of these countries had meaningful and, more importantly, growing, dissatisfied, deeply religious parts of their population, susceptible to being inflamed with religious outrage, which is one of the most potent kinds of outrage there is. And so instead of taking an approach of, no matter how hard you'd have to work to do it, generating some inclusion, and then letting that create splits among the religious. Let it be a debate among their community instead of a thing to unite against, that was a missed opportunity. And this other one, number 12, there's an amazing Israeli NGO called Women Wage Peace. They now have a Palestinian counterpart that has a different name. I think it might be called Women of the Sun. I'm not sure. But one of the things that they write about and speak about is that there were almost zero women involved in any of these negotiating teams. You're probably thinking, Hanan Ashrawi, or if you remember, Yael Dayan, didn't she get sent to go meet with Arafat? But like that's kind of it. And their point is that if there had been a decision right off the bat to include a lot of women with expertise in different parts of life, it's not that add women automatically achieve success, although maybe many people in the room would disagree with me. It's that why risk missing the potential insights, ideas, and understanding of the fabric of how these societies work, and instead default to this kind of comfortable old boy, elite political negotiating club that appears to be ever more detached from common folks. Can I do two more? Two more? Two more of these squares before we turn it over. All right. I want to talk about 15 and 16 in one block. This is more recent. This really only starts in 2011. The catastrophic collapse of Syria into civil war, and the Syrian government's long-time stockpiling and then use of chemical weapons against its own citizens. A lot of people don't think about this as one of the things that helped thwart Oslo. This is a big miss on the part of how analysts from outside the region fail to understand something that's deeply on the minds of most Israelis. So Israeli intelligence services, for a long time were trying to alert the rest of the world to the fact that the Assad government was stockpiling chemical weapons. Now, I'm going to tell you, my government in the United States damaged the ability of Western governments to interrupt any government's stockpiling of chemical weapons by launching the Iraq War in 2003 on false claims that Iraq had chemical weapons and potentially nuclear weapons. What Iraq may have had was minuscule compared to what Syria was stockpiling all along the way. And the Syrian regime took full advantage of the fact that Western credibility got shredded by the exposure of the fact that this was not real intelligence and that the premise for that war was not real. In any event, think about what it's like to be living in Israel as a Jewish Israeli in a place that is geographically very small and that is multi-ethnic and multi-religious, as it is, even just within the Green Line, and to have to your immediate north a multi-religious and multi-ethnic state, Lebanon, that has, over the last 75 years, alternated between fragile democracy and delicate agreements between the three different religious ethnic groups, and then collapsed into civil war with massive war crimes and atrocities committed by each side against the other, only to be sort of stitched back together again and collapse. To see that happen again in another neighboring country, and then to see it descend into one of the parties, in this case the Assad government, using chemical weapons and killing tens of thousands of its citizens, including children, and to know that Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and the Assad government work closely together, and that Hezbollah's military fights in Syria on the side of Assad, and to know that the Assad government ultimately was forced to give up most, and we hope all, of its chemical weapons, but they could not account for all of them in the end. It's very much on the minds of Israelis that Hezbollah has over 150,000 rockets. The rockets are better than the ones Hamas has, and that they might have chemical or biological weapons to attach to those rockets, and they are also an Islamic triumphalist religious movement. Israelis think about this all the time, and they're really worried about it right now. So when you are absolutely paralyzed by the thought that what you just saw happen to innocent people in Syria on a really unimaginable scale could be you, it does not put the Israeli public in a psychological place to be finding the headspace to think, how do we work out this thing with the Palestinians? And what do we need to be doing differently for that? It instead puts most rank and file Israelis into a posture of, oh God, this is really scary. How can we trust anybody who's immediately around us, and just what capabilities do people have? So I'm naming that because it's something that just gets dropped out of the equation. And it speaks to something that is a general principle I feel like is a takeaway for me in studying this conflict, which is you have two populations of people. There is a power asymmetry, for sure. Israel is much more powerful than the Palestinians and controls the lives of millions of Palestinians. At the same time, in order to reach any kind of agreement that would end this conflict and be sustainable, there needs to be the capacity for the majority of both of those populations to muster the psychological courage that it would take to agree to come out of defensive mode and be in a different frame of mind, that I would have the courage, muster the courage to take these risks. I think it's the responsibility of the international community to focus intensely on that question and identify every single step that they can imagine that contributes to the possibility of helping both Palestinians and Israelis muster that courage. And I could list off for you all the reasons why, for Palestinians, it's an enormous leap of faith to try to muster that courage as well. But if you can't get those folks, if they don't feel supported, loved, and backed up in the effort to muster that courage, then their natural response is going to be resentful cynicism towards people from outside their own country, essentially telling them what they ought to have the courage to be moral enough to do. And that is a huge social and psychological barrier that helped thwart this process. I'm done with these squares, And I'm just going to tell you that I don't use the word "what killed Oslo" anymore, because believe it or not, after all the doom and gloom I just told you, I do not think Oslo is dead. I think that the first part of my presentation focused on all those positive things Oslo accomplished. And I will tell you that a lot of Israelis and Palestinians have extended the work that Oslo accomplished unofficially. You might have heard of the team that put together the Geneva Accords, which is largely made up of diplomats who were negotiating during the Oslo process. They brought in a whole bunch more people to work on these same issues, not just water and electricity, but coming up with creative, plausible agreements that potentially both populations could live with around those other issues, those 5 issues on the front page of the packet. And their attitude has been, we're just going to keep doing the research and the hard work to prepare for the day, so that when the day comes, we actually have roadmaps and plans that could be implemented so that what we do succeeds. And I will tell you that I think the ultimate resolution of this conflict will involve either what Oslo originally set out to do or some creative variation of it. A creative variation of it might be some kind of confederation rather than 2 states. It might be something I don't even know the political science language for. But I think it's not going to be a single binational democratic state with a full and unlimited Palestinian right of return. I don't think that's going to happen. And I don't think it's going to be the ethnic cleansing of all Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza and a greater pure Jewish state, which is the language that the far messianic right, religious right in Israel now uses. And I don't think it's going to be the result of one group claiming military victory over the other and then just imposing its will. So now that I've spoken at great length, whatever time we still have for questions or to conversation, we have. And thank you for listening.
So I think we have about 20 minutes for questions. And as I said, if you have a question, raise your hand and come up here. I'll have... Could somebody get him a cup of water? So can you be listening while you're waiting for water?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll start with 2 questions because I'm here already and we have a second. 2 questions. One, you said at the beginning that each one of us has kind of in our head what happened to Oslo, and I certainly do. I have memories, and I've been reading it before, but 2 or 3 Israeli leaders offering what appeared to be reasonable packages, and first Arafat said no thank you with no counter. Like, it's not like if you say I don't expect, because I would also like an extra $1 million in bribe, or I would like 100,000 Palestinians. Like, no thank you. And then some years later, a similar situation that I think it was Ehud Barak, he gave Abbas something that was even better. And Abbas said, no thank you. And again, no counter. So given all these questions, but it's, at the end of the day, there are 2 leaders who can move their people to say yes or no. And I just, if you can comment on that apparent puzzle.
No, that's an important question. So I have a couple thoughts about that. Number one, I've read all kinds of what I will call polemical responses to that question, either from pro-Palestinian writers or sort of the, let's say, center to right-wing Israeli writers. So what you should know is that the polemical writing from pro-Palestinian writers totally disputes that that's what happened in those rooms. The Israelis, including the Israelis who were in those rooms, for the most part say, no, that's exactly what happened. The Americans who were in those rooms, they don't fully align with what the Israelis say, but they lean in that direction. What they will say is, look, it's not like Barak or, well, let's just stick with Barak in the year 2000 and 2001. It's not like he could put down a piece of paper and say, I've got an offer I can deliver to you right now on all the five final status issues. I await your response. I mean, they'd been meeting for weeks in the last weeks of Bill Clinton's administration. He was sort of trying, well, the George W. Bush administration announced after he was declared the winner of that election that they were, as soon as he took office, planning to withdraw American diplomatic involvement in persuading the two parties to finish the work of this agreement. And that was a devastating blow to this process. And so the Clinton administration thought, well, and first of all, Clinton tried to talk him out of that, okay? He didn't succeed. So Clinton scrambled, and he spent most of the last weeks of his presidency going back and forth to the Egyptian town of Taba, right? And Barak and Arafat met there, and those teams were meeting there, and they were talking about all of these issues. So I tend to believe that I tend to believe the Americans in the room, not because I'm an American or because Americans are more trustworthy than anybody else. I tend to believe them because I feel like they have fewer reasons to lie about what happened. And I feel, just reading them, and I read Bill Clinton's memoir about this, he has criticism for both teams during those last few weeks. He thought they could accomplish this together, and he definitely agrees with the perspective that in the end, Arafat became obstreperous and made up his mind that he was done for the time being with negotiating and was going to wait and see what the new administration did, and was already working on proposing a strategy of turning to a second intifada to try and see if some waves of fighting and violence and disruption of Israeli lives might then result in more pliability on the Israeli side. So Clinton verifies all of those things, but he also verifies that he says that a lot of the Israeli team and Barak himself were extremely arrogant, and it damaged the ability of trust to be built throughout the process with their Palestinian counterparts. And he chalks some of that up to cultural misunderstanding. He said that he felt like some of it was actually getting to understand that when Israelis, in Israeli culture, when it's time to sit down and do business, it's time to sit down and do business. In a huge overgeneralization, Arab culture is so different than that, and involves a kind of different sort of trust building set of give and take that never really fully took. Now, he says that you might think this was, maybe a small thing, but it counted for a lot when the chips were down and we were running out of time. So for me, the most convincing thing about laying a fair measure of blame at Arafat's feet is the part about it's not why the negotiations failed in that moment, it's what happened after. Arafat's decision to give the green light to Hamas and to other groups closer to his own orbit to unleash terrorist violence against Israelis is a true fact. And that was a catastrophic decision that for sure poisoned, the possibility of the process going forward in the immediate short term. I've already told you some of my personal take on Arafat. I am not a fan of dictators. I am not a fan of autocrats. He wanted to be another Middle Eastern autocrat running the state of Palestine, who he was convinced Israel and the West would deal with on a pragmatic basis, in the same way that Israel dealt with Egypt's autocratic rulers pragmatically. And frankly, in some ways it's easier for Israel to deal with consistent autocrats who are not likely to change their policy towards Israel. Right? All of that, I think, is true. That said, I'm very uncomfortable with usually what comes as the rhetoric following the claim that this is really Arafat's fault for not accepting a reasonable offer. For a couple reasons. Number one, if the Israeli government from that point forward was sincere, that what they really wanted was this reasonable deal, but maybe Arafat's just a brutal dictator and a jerk, and maybe it's just good that he's gone, and we'll wait for things to get better, a government that believes that would not have kept building new settlements. A government that believes that would not have kept empowering and funding the yeshivot that support these most radical strains of ultranationalist, messianic, religious Jewish ideology. If you keep building new facts on the ground that tell the Palestinians, you are suckers, we never intended for you to have an actual state, then you've blown up your credibility for saying, but at one point we offered you one and your autocratic leader of the moment turned it down. And to me, if there was an Israeli leader who turned down a reasonable offer, I wouldn't 10 years later or 20 years later say, therefore Israelis have now lost all their moral claims to what would be fair for them. I would say that's a terrible thing that happened. And yes, we should definitely hold accountable the people who screwed that up or made a horrifying, immoral decision in the moment. The other thing I want to say is that, going all the way back to the early 2000s, the Saudi government did put forward an Arab peace initiative that was also kind of the equivalent of Barak's offer. It was like not 100% what the Israelis wanted, but it was like 92% of maybe what the Israelis wanted. The only thing that would really be problematic in the Arab peace initiative that the Saudis put forward, and by the way, the entire Arab League ratified and endorsed the Arab peace initiative, I think around 2006. So the Arab League repeatedly says, we've put an offer out on the table and there's been no response from Israel. And there has been no formal diplomatic response from Israel for this initiative. And the initiative says permanent recognition of Israel within the Green Line, 2 capitals for 2 states, Israeli capital in West Jerusalem, right where it is, a Palestinian capital in the Arab neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, some version of the status quo regime for the holy sites, which already is this crazy mixed regime, but it basically works. And the only thing the Israelis have a good reason to not like about the Arab Peace Initiative is it's intentionally vague about the Palestinian right of return. It basically just says, and the Palestinians' right of return will be honored, and it doesn't specify how. But Arab League members have said, new, so that's the part we'll probably have to negotiate about. You're going to say you want to create a regime where a maximum of 200,000 Palestinians can come actually reside in Israel proper, and the others can get a generous compensation package, and all who want to move to the state of Palestine can move to the state of Palestine, and you're going to have security requests that put you in charge of security more than the Palestinians want you to be. And you're going to have to deal with the people who can't abide this Palestinian flag in East Jerusalem over some Capitol building there. But we could probably, you were going to have to negotiate that stuff anyway to get to the end of this agreement. And I've never heard, I've heard a lot of Israeli diplomats speak about the Arab Peace Initiative. They never say bad things about it. They don't say, oh, it's just a bunch of smoke and mirrors. They usually say, you know, it's good that people are trying to use problem-solving thinking about this. And if, you know, if negotiations with some of the other Arab countries in the region could go forward, then, you know, maybe it will become a useful element. But they've really made a strategic decision not to directly respond to the offer. And maybe they're right to not respond to the offer. I don't know. I'm just saying that when people get into rhetorical arguments with each other to sort of score moral points, you can make an argument from the other side that says, well, the Israelis never responded to something. And the Israelis can say, well, the other side never responded to this thing, so that means they'll never respond to a thing. So then what I want to ask someone is, okay, so then what? What do you propose? Spell it out. What do you propose going forward? If not, trying again. And I think it's the responsibility of people who play these games, not play these games, but make these arguments to then say, okay, here's what I propose. I know we have way more questions here. Who is next? Oh yes, go ahead. I'll try to be much more succinct.
And it'll be very easy, in less than 30 seconds. This is a next step question. In the world of negotiating, we talk about what's the best alternative to a negotiated solution. One of the things that you did today, and Yasher Koach for doing this, is you strung us through all of history, but let's go back to this morning's Haftorah. King Saul doesn't like the fact that King David, when he was a kid before he was King David, and he tries to kill him. You talked about Egypt doing the same thing. I mean, it's been throughout all history. So my question for you is, given where we are today, what is our best alternative to a negotiated solution? It's an easy question, maybe an impossible answer.
So if I want to make sure I understand the question, so the question is, let's say that it's not possible to have a negotiated resolution. And so then what's the best alternative? That's a completely fair question. And I think that the answer that, I mean, Netanyahu's answer to that has been managing the conflict, right? Sort of like maintaining the status quo and trying to prevent it from exploding. Again, I would have a lot more respect for that answer if they weren't building more settlements and making it ever more impossible to, someday in the future, do something different. I also just feel like if you're going to keep building more settlements and increasing the Jewish population in the West Bank, if you're preparing to have one state, then you need to start telling people how that's going to work, and will it be a state where everyone has equal rights on the vote? And then is that good? Is that good for the Jews? I don't know. But I'm not going to cavalierly say I know what's best, nor would I moralize and say that a state that's been through what Israel's been through, including, again, that situation with Hezbollah and this question about rockets and chemical weapons. I think it would be pretty morally defensible for any Israeli government to say, look, there are a bunch of things that need to change before we can negotiate about anything. However, as an act of goodwill, we're not expanding our footprint among the Palestinians. We are maintaining our military presence and trying to manage the conflict and keep a lid on violence, and we're doing that indefinitely because there are too many groups with the capacity to commit atrocities against us who appear to be religiously motivated to try and do so. And that is the crummy situation that we're in. I personally would respect that and support it. It just needs to be matched by, sort of like the companion actions that show that this isn't actually just an argument that's being made in service of a plan to somehow have this greater Israel that I think is a disaster in terms of its viability and the possibility of it remaining a democracy. Yeah.
Last question.
Okay. No, I never got to the one from over here. I'll say something brief about that. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful overview you've given us, and you've asked the international community to scaffold the actions that will return us towards the Oslo process. One of those actions was supported by the Government of Canada. It was an international initiative to support Israeli-Palestinian disengagement. It collapsed about 2010. One of the reasons that it collapsed was a changing perception of Israel in the international community. I wonder if you could tell us, give us an indication, when did Israel become the bad guy? How was that engineered through an international information, disinformation campaign? And what's the action that goes with that to scaffold a return to an Oslo peace process?
Ooh, boy. Before I respond to that question, I actually want to say a quick word about the issue around school curricula. And this may not directly respond to your question from before, but one of the things that is an unfortunate piece of why this hasn't succeeded is actually that the school curricula authorized by the Palestinian Authority and by the Israeli government, and increasingly so as time has gone by, are completely anti-two-state solution and increasingly and with greater fervor seek to absolutely expunge and delegitimize the narrative of the other. So it is definitely true that a lot of public school curricula in Israel have really gone out of their way to just sort of strip Palestinian narratives out of history. And of course, with this new government in place, an amazing group like the Parents Bereaved Circle, the Israeli and Palestinian Parents Circle, who used to send pairs, an Israeli and a Palestinian adult who both lost a child to violence from the other side, to high schools all across Israel where the students would ask questions. The education minister from one of the far-right parties just successfully got them banned from going to Israeli high schools. The PA's curricular stuff is also really bad. There is a rhetoric of demonizing Zionism that sometimes slips into demonizing Jews. And perhaps it's, some might say, more understandable that if you're living under occupation and you have a history of many of your relatives and friends having lost their homes and their lands and then never having been allowed to return to them, what would you expect but that your curriculum would be hostile towards the power that did that? I have some sympathy for that, but this was an agreement that did include commitments by both sides not to do the thing that they're both doing, right? It included commitments to look at all of their different forms of communication, not just media, but also curricula, and to intentionally educate people so that they would have familiarity and greater empathy. And so, I, as somebody who teaches a dual narrative approach, it pains me to see that that's a process that keeps gaining momentum in the wrong direction. And especially, when I think about NGOs in Israel that do amazing work. So your question about like when, I think your question is kind of a version of like how and when did, let's say, widespread international perception of Israel become so negative? Or the way that you put it was sort of like, to the degree that in the world of discussing international politics, whether it's on campuses or around dinner tables, as humans, we have a part of our brain that is lazy, that wants there to just be a bad guy and a good guy. And so it was convenient for Israel to be David and the Arabs to be Goliath. And then at some point, Israel became Goliath and the Palestinians became David. I mean, there isn't a single moment in time. I'm not sure that I don't even know that it doesn't seem to me like that has happened across the board everywhere. But I guess what I would say is a lot of historians who've studied the conflict point to the first Intifada in 1987 as a major turning point in terms of how, let's say, Western societies and Western academic culture started pivoting very hard towards seeing the cause of Palestinian nationalism as a anti-colonial liberation movement. And I'm not a historian or a media analyst, so I'm just giving you my gut reaction as a 54-year-old American. I have a feeling that in the 70s, the PLO and other radical Palestinian militant groups miscalculated when they thought blowing up the Olympics was going to make them popular among Westerners, when they thought having German terrorists be the ones to carry out the hijacking that led to the Entebbe thing. The optics of people with German accents who were German radicals explaining why what they were doing was anti-imperialist and not anti-Semitic, because in fact they loathe anti-Semitism, clunk, like people hated that and hated them for it. And, but I think that first Intifada was the first time that people had the visual experience over and over and over again of teenagers throwing rocks at dudes in tanks, right? And some of the Israeli leaders at the time, including Rabin, they didn't really have good PR filters. They were saying, we're going to break their bones until they submit. So I think that is a part of it. I also think that the failure of Oslo to manifest an agreement, a durable agreement, led to a real opening for groups with a more uncompromising position on what should happen to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to kind of step into, to take the lead in giving voice to the sort of official line of what it means to be, quote, pro-Palestinian, right? So the official line really shifted in terms of discourse with Westerners to, we need to end the occupation. It's really now shifted very much to the Nakba and 1948, and that the refusal of Israel after that War of Independence ended to allow the Palestinian civilian population that was no longer there to return to their homes, that's become the top line of sort of the the narrative, the prevalent narrative, the prevalent Palestinian narrative is that's the core injustice that needs to be remedied, and anything short of that crosses the line into maintaining a kind of settler colonialist, oppressive, state of affairs. And what bothers me about uncompromising positions is that they have no room for nuance, and they are incapable of expressing any empathy for anyone on the other side. So, is there an argument to be made that there's an analysis about Israel that is connected in some ways to the ways in which Western powers have oppressed people in other parts of the world? That's a part that should be a part of the conversation. But is there also an indigenous Jewish history that goes back thousands of years? Is there also a history of systemic and at times relentless anti-Semitism, mainly in the Christian world, but also in the Muslim world, that makes the circumstances surrounding the Jewish people and their relationship to this land very different in many respects from a typical anti-colonialist narrative, and therefore requires some measure of empathy and seeking to really understand what has brought these peoples into this same place, with some measure of compassion, curiosity, and empathy about their story. That's what gets thrown out the window, and I see it from the left and I see it from the right. And it is hard to argue with someone who's coming at you with, an uncompromising set of propositions, because I'm not going to argue the opposite set of uncompromising positions. I'm basically, if I'm going to argue, I'm going to argue for them to think completely differently about how they approach this topic. And sometimes I get depressed about that, but I have got to believe that there's some hope for humanity, so I refuse to succumb to that depression.
Okay, so I see there are a few people in the room yet. That's very nice. Thank you, Rabbi Maurice, for this talk that seems to me barely scratched the surface. So tomorrow, 4 hours? Seriously, for those of you who are interested, this afternoon at 6:30, we are meeting for Mincha Seudah Shlishit, which means the third meal, Havdalah, and there'll be no speeches. It's titled Speak Your Mind. I don't expect to have many people there. There may be a couple of dozen, so we can sit around the table, have a glass of wine, and just chat much more informally, and hope to see some of you there tonight. It's 6:30, and Shabbat Shalom. It will be right here at 6:30. We'll have in this room. We'll have the Mincha service. That'll be very quick, 15-20 minutes, and then we'll go downstairs for a Seudah, and that's where we will chat and talk until we had enough. It could be 30 minutes, it could be 90 minutes, probably not 90. And then we'll do Havdalah and go home. So thank you all, and again, Shabbat Shalom.